This, in other words, ladies and gentlemen, is the collapse of a financial system in real time. That is what we are watching, and that is going to precipitate something like a depression in the Western world. So again, when does all of this happening? It's happening. It's happening in real time, right before our eyes. And my fear is that nuclear strikes, limited or otherwise, may be on the table, if for no other reason that the Israelis have them, and nobody in the United States is going to stop them from being used. Europe's welfare state is at capacity. It's been completely mismanaged, and it's been overwhelmed by foreigners that aren't even subjects of Great Britain, and if they are, they have not assimilated into the UK, nor can they. Ladies and gentlemen, these three stories, debt, nukes, and civil war, this is a characterization of exactly the madness of the elites that are running the Western world into the ground. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope all of you are warmer than I am. It is the 1st of April here in the DC area, and it's still a little cold. Hopefully we're trending out of that. As cold as it is here, it seems to be getting hot around the rest of the world. And in today's video, what we're going to talk about is debt, nukes, and civil war. So this is really the second current events based video that I've made, and this is going to be quite long like the last one, maybe 30 minutes or so. So if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, something like that, I encourage you to pause the video, get a cup of coffee or tea, and sit back so you can digest all that we're going to talk about today. Let's start with debt. I have been asked over the last couple of years in various interviews, on podcasts, things of that nature, what is it that's going to bring the whole house of cards down in the Western world? And my answer has been when interest rates rise. Now, why do I say that? Well, basically, since the 1970s, the United States and Europe have been deindustrialized and financialized. That basically means that economic activity no longer drives wealth accumulation in the Western world, and it hasn't for decades. So what has? Well, basically, it's been asset prices rising. This is why capital holders, or you might say the quintillionaires who own Fortune 500 companies, they have maybe stakes in private equity firms, they collect dividend checks from stocks that they own.
The term quintillionaire came out of my frustration at people's referencing those in the elite class as elite, right? Those who are getting this money first are described as the elites. And I thought that's a misnomer. That's a bad word to describe this group of larcenistic scoundrels. So I thought quintillionaire is a good way to describe them, because it gets at the quintillion effect, which has basically been documented in economics for a long time. The money printers really distribute the money through a network of their friends who use it first. A great example would be that banks use the money that is printed to buy back their own stock. So that's what I mean by quintillionaire. They shouldn't be called elites or described positively in any way.
They have gotten extremely wealthy, and the rest of the population that presumably is involved in or engaged in the real economy, their standard of living has either completely flatlined, or I would say over the last 10 years especially, it's begun to decline precipitously, and we're beginning to see the consequences of that. Well, why is it happening now? It's happening because since 2020 and the massive deluge of fiscal spending that governments did to sort of plug the lockdown gap that lasted way too long and imploded Western economies. Again, whether that was intentional or not, it's not really the point. The point is that the real economy, what was left of it, the service-based economy in the United States, small businesses, things like that, has basically completely imploded. It's been crippled. And so the government has had to spend lots of money to plug that gap.
Federal deficits spent into the economy with the Fed engaged in QE is helicopter money, i.e. money printing.
Well, we can get away with that. We can sort of live or subsist in a financialized economy so long as interest rates are low. Unfortunately, interest rates are now beginning to skyrocket everywhere.
US interest rates are not coming down. In fact, it's flying higher. And this is bad for everyone. People with mortgages are going to get squeezed. Business and personal loans will also get repriced upwards. And if you're invested in the markets, we are on the precipice of a collapse.
And this began, if you recall, in 2022 with the Fed rate hikes. Well, there are three areas that I want to focus on, these articles I'm going to reference, that expose the extent to which that interest rates are really beginning to tear apart the economy. One is private equity, two are the banks, and three is fiscal spending or government debt markets. So let's talk first about private equity. There was a report that I recently read called The Next Big Short, Hidden Risks Behind Private Equity's $8 trillion market. Now I'm going to read some highlights to you to give you a sense of just how lethal the private equity debt really is. So let me just read some of this to you, and then we'll talk about it. The rise of private equity. Private equity has exploded in popularity since the beginning of the 2010s during periods of low interest rates. In 1980, there were 24 PE funds. By 2015, this number had increased to approximately 6,600. By 2022, there were 17,000 in the United States. The growth of assets under management in private equity has been equally impressive. In 2000, private equity firms collectively managed $579 billion. By 2022, this figure surged to $7.8 trillion. In North America, the private equity industry ballooned to $4 trillion. Okay, now listen to this next part. The recent and rapid rate hike cycle by the Fed in 2022 created a world of uncertainty for private equity. Private equity makes sense when rates are at zero and you can buy companies for 4x or 5x earnings. But when rates are at 5% and you're buying companies for 10x or 12x earnings, it's a problem. This uncertainty continued into 2023, causing a global slowdown of deal activity. Deal value and count fell by 60% and 35%, respectively, from the 2021 peaks. In 2023, deal volume collapsed to 44%, below 2022 numbers, the lowest levels in a decade. Fundraising also suffered due to 38% fewer buyout funds closing. Moody's, which is a credit ratings agency, downgraded the credit outlook for BlackRock, KKR, and other private equity firms from stable to negative due to concerns about an increase in their loans that are either in default, close to default, or on non-accrual status. So basically the consequences are that buyers are now faced with a substantially increased cost of debt, currently about 380 basis points, 3 or 4% percentage points above the 20-year average in the United States. The risks in a high interest rate, low deal, highly leveraged, and low return environment are immense. Now, what private equity has done to conceal these losses is they've packaged them into a derivative, something called a collateralized loan obligation.
So one of the things that was scary about 2008 is they repackaged the bad debt and sold it off as derivatives and as CDOs, and then they did synthetic CDOs. They're repackaging all of this debt as something called CLOs, and they're selling it to all the pension funds.
What?
All the pensions have been buying up this debt.
This is basically the same thing as a mortgage-backed security, except instead, inside of it are not mortgages, inside of it are all of these loans that have gone to small businesses that have to refinance year over year with higher and higher rates, and needless to say, that is blowing up these companies. That's why bankruptcies are spreading across the private economy. So that's in private equity. Let's talk about what's happening in the banks. Now, the FDIC quarterly banking profile report just came out for fourth quarter of 2024. Now listen to what they have to say. The next chart shows the level of unrealized losses on held to maturity and available for sale securities portfolios. Total unrealized losses of $482.4 billion increased $118.4 billion or 32.5% from the prior quarter. Longer-term interest rates such as the 30-year mortgage rate and the 10-year treasury rate increased in the fourth quarter after declining in the third quarter, decreasing the value of securities reported by banks and increasing unrealized losses. So again, unrealized losses just mean that the value of the asset that these banks are holding is declining, but it's unrealized because they haven't had to roll it over. They haven't had to sell it back or refinance it. And a lot of those loans are, or rather, a lot of those assets are U.S. Treasury bonds, and U.S. Treasury debt is falling as interest rates rise. So again, how does financialization end in private equity, in the banks, et cetera, et cetera? It ends when interest rates rise because you have to refinance, and everybody can sort of float their debt so long as interest rates are low. Well, it appears as though that low interest rate period is over. Now, this gets worse when we talk about the fiscal situation. So take a look at this tweet from the Hobbesian letter. It says U.S. interest payments are set to rise even higher. U.S. interest expense on national debt hit a record 1.2 trillion over the last 12 months. To put this into perspective, defense spending was $900 billion during the same period. If rates remain flat, interest payments are set to hit $1.5 trillion by the end of the year, doubling in just 4 years. Even if the Fed cuts rates by 100 basis points, or 1 percentage point, interest costs will still hit $1.3 trillion in 2025. This all assumes the economy will avoid a recession or any material economic slowdown. This is a crisis. So as you can see, in private equity, which again is tied to the small business economy, it's tied to Wall Street, it's tied to the stock market, it's tied to derivatives, and by extension the banks, and the unrealized losses that are now sitting on bank balance sheets. And of course, what's happening in Washington, D.C. at the federal level is that debt servicing costs are rising because interest rates are rising, and economies by extension are slowing. This, in other words, ladies and gentlemen, is the collapse of a financial system in real time. That is what we are watching, and that is going to precipitate, I have to think, something like a depression in the Western world. So again, when does all of this happening? It's happening. It's happening in real time, right before our eyes. We just have yet to see the default spiral, which is to say when interest rates really start to skyrocket and get out of control. That kind of fire sale environment is the next step. That's where we're headed. The next story I want to talk about is if Netanyahu is Dr. Strangelove. So there was a very disturbing article. Frankly speaking, if you read it and understand its implications, you'll lose sleep at night. I certainly have. But it's called Will Nuclear Deterrence Fail in the Middle East? This was written by Mark Gaffney. I will share all of these links below. Now listen to what he says here, because he gives some context as to exactly the nature of what we're dealing with the nuclear suite that the Israelis have. And remember that the United States stood steadfastly opposed to any nuclear proliferation during the Cold War, and that included Israel. All right, what does all of this mean? For starters, it means that the familiar reference to the biblical Samson, who destroyed the Philistine temple by pulling down the columns, was already out of date when Hirsch published the Samson option in 1991. Neutron bombs are not weapons of last resort. They are tactical weapons intended for warfighting, designed to efficiently kill humans while sparing the neighborhood. Originally intended for deployment in Germany to halt a theoretical Soviet invasion of Western Europe, President Jimmy Carter deferred their production in April 1978 after the issue became highly controversial in Europe and in the U.S. One of the principal arguments against neutron weapons is that they lower the threshold for general nuclear war. Carter found the neutron bomb morally distasteful and wanted to cancel it outright, but he was persuaded the weapon still had some utility as a bargaining chip with the Soviets. His successor, Ronald Reagan, resumed production but never deployed neutron bombs to Europe. Production was finally halted by President H.W. Bush in 1992 as a result of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. Thanks to the INF Treaty, the U.S. destroyed its stockpile. Israel's leaders were, of course, privy to the conversation surrounding the neutron bomb and the controversy. They surely knew what they were doing in the 1980s when they made the informed decision to build them. But the contra-arguments that eventually led to the cancellation of the U.S. program carried no weight in Israel. The very same set of facts that Carter found repugnant made the neutron bomb especially appealing to the Israelis. Here, after all, was a tailor-made weapon for use against Israel's enemies. The moral issues failed to register because Israeli Jews do not regard Gentiles as human beings, but rather as subhuman. So, they feel no moral compunction about killing them in large numbers. Think bugs on a sidewalk. Given such values, or lack thereof, it's understandable and hardly surprising Zionists would embrace such a weapon. 2 weeks ago, the American trader and former Israeli nuclear spy Jonathan Pollard warned during a YouTube podcast that Israel could find itself in another war with Egypt in the very near future. Pollard added that in the event of such a war, Israel might have to use neutron bombs against the Egyptian army, currently deployed in force with heavy armor just south of the Philadelphia corridor. By one estimate, the Egyptian force there numbers 50,000 men. By another account, 70,000. The Egyptian troops have been deployed to prevent the IDF from driving 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza and into Egypt.
Right now, we really don't have the heavy maneuver forces that are required to fight an Egyptian army in Sinai. I mean, would we win? Yes, but as I said, at a monumental cost. We have weapons at our disposal. Conventional EMPs, not nuclear, but conventional EMPs and neutron weapons that could destroy the Egyptian army in the Sinai within one day. The EMPs, based tactical EMPs, would immobilize, if you will, entire Egyptian units, brigade, regimental, even divisional size units. We'd have to drop a lot of bombs, but they would work. And then once the Egyptian soldiers got out of their vehicles that don't work anymore, then you hit them with a neutron weapon and you just kill all of them.
A little bit of context for this article. Right now there is what looks to be a buildup of U.S. forces and Israeli posturing for a war against Iran. Now, Iran is a power that does not have nuclear weapons, but it does have nuclear capability. It can enrich uranium, for example. And this is perceived by the Israelis, or at least by Netanyahu and his government, by militant Zionism in general, as an existential threat to Israel. The problem is that there is no clear-cut way to destroy the nuclear facilities. At least the Israelis cannot do so without the United States.
And that requires a lot of aircraft. It requires a lot of time over the targets, right? That's just to clear out all the defenses so that you can then bring in the forces that hit the targets down below. The Israelis don't have a strategic air force. They have a tactical air force. It's designed for fighting in and around Israel itself. It's not that big. The United States, of course, has a huge air force. It has lots of capability, cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, you name it.
Unfortunately, in the United States, the Trump administration is even more pro-Zionist than the Biden administration was. And furthermore, there is a growing consensus inside of defense circles in the U.S. and I think among Netanyahu's government, which is already fractured and fragile for various reasons that we've talked about before. Some people believe that a civil war in Israel, for example, is possible. Netanyahu is contending with corruption charges that threaten not just his government, but jail time for Netanyahu. So all of these things are swirling around, and that suggests that the likelihood that the Israeli government could take this kind of drastic action is even higher. But it gets worse. Historically speaking, the use of nuclear weapons on a limited basis or otherwise has been perceived as dangerous. In other words, the use of nuclear weapons in any capacity was widely considered unacceptable. However, there have been dissenting views to that. And I want to read from a paper called Victory is Possible by Colin Gray and Keith Payne that was written, I believe, in the 1980s, addressing the viability of a limited nuclear strike strategy. Now, I, for the record, view this as insane. I think it is a total disaster for the world and for the United States and could boomerang. In other words, it could cause a nuclear escalation that would get completely out of control very quickly. However, what you're going to hear in this article, I think, is beginning to gain consensus in the Trump White House, perhaps in the Pentagon, and almost certainly in Israeli circles, where they perceive Iran to be an existential threat that must be destroyed no matter the consequences. Listen to what they have to say here. Victory or defeat in nuclear war is possible, and such a war may have to be waged to that point. And the clearer the vision of successful war termination, the more likely war can be waged intelligently at earlier stages. The most frightening threat to the Soviet Union would be the destruction or serious impairment of its political system. Thus, the United States should be able to destroy key leadership cadres, their means of communication, and some of the instruments of domestic control. The USSR, with its gross over-centralization of authority epitomized by its vast bureaucracy in Moscow, should be highly vulnerable to such an attack. The Soviet Union might cease to function if its security agency, the KGB, were severely crippled. If the Moscow bureaucracy could be eliminated, damaged, or isolated, the USSR might disintegrate into anarchy, hence the extensive civil defense preparations intended to ensure the survival of the Soviet leadership. In other words, these defense experts believe that if you cut off the head of the snake, the body will collapse. A similar view is gaining traction about Iran. I was in a Twitter space, for example, recently, and granted, these people are not what I would deem experts, but they were promulgating the message that Iran is weak, that Iran has no countermeasures that they can take against the United States, its forces, or by proxy, that it cannot harm the United States. And so, if we were to take unilateral action against them and with precision and surgical strikes take out their nuclear facilities, presumably or potentially using limited nuclear operations, that we could regime change Iran, that the state would basically collapse, and all of a sudden the threat of nuclear escalation or proliferation in Iran would completely dissipate, or it would be neutralized. This is the kind of madness, the Dr. Strangelove level of analysis that's going on in Israel and the United States to this day.
Hey, what about Major Kong?
So the question we have to ask is nuclear war a possibility if, in fact, war with Iran happens and a broader escalation with the Muslim world occurs? I mentioned Egypt a moment ago. I talked about that in my last video. But then, obviously, there's conflict potentially with the Turks, who are now in Syria, or other Arab states that could potentially collapse if the Arab leadership simply sits back and watches the Israelis continue to kill people in Gaza or target regimes like Iran. So the bottom line is that this situation, just by rhetoric alone, and by the recent mobilization of American assets over there. We're sending another carrier strike group, cargo planes are showing up. The logistics required to scale an attack, it appears all of these things are moving into position. And my fear is that nuclear strikes, limited or otherwise, may be on the table, if for no other reason that the Israelis have them, and nobody in the United States is going to stop them from being used. So this is where we stand today, folks. That brings me to the third story. Potential civil war in England. Now, those of you that have followed me for some time probably remember the video that I made back in August of last year addressing the tragic deaths of 3 infant English girls that were killed by an immigrant, and that was a flashpoint that sent lots of Britons into the streets, caused mass protests. Now, they were sort of downplayed in the mainstream media, and the government, led by Keir Starmer, who I think his popularity, his mandate, if he ever had one, has completely collapsed since then. All he's done is demonize any nationalist or nativist movement in England to address the immigration problem there through censorship, imprisonment, or worse, is basically steering Great Britain into a civil war. Now, I want to read some excerpts from an Englishman named Matt Goodwin, who wrote I think a pretty compelling essay about the immigration situation in England, which is going nuclear. to be sure. So listen to what he has to say here. The Office for Budget Responsibility quietly notes in a new report that mass immigration is contributing to what is known as capital dilution, or what I call the population trap. This is what happens when populations expand so quickly that the sheer scale and speed of this population change exceeds the capacity of the state to provide its own citizens with functioning public services, such as a functioning national health service and education system, as well as things like affordable and available housing and safe neighborhoods. Mass immigration, in short, is managed decline because it's putting enormous pressure on a state that is already struggling to provide public services for its existing population. This is what the Canadians, the Swedes, and many others are now finally realizing, that the sheer scale of demographic change over the last 20 years or so has been so great that the state is now simply unable to perform its most basic functions. And this is what is now happening in the UK, even if much of the elite class ignores it. Since 1997, net migration added nearly 6 million people to the United Kingdom, with close to 4 million arriving since 2010 under conservative-led governments, the most pro-immigration government in history. In 2022 and 2023 alone, more than 2.5 million people migrated into the United Kingdom. But at the same time, economic growth, has remained low. Productivity and wage growth have stagnated, and the country has recorded the worst GDP per capita figure since the 1970s. Where is the booming, dynamic, innovative, prosperous economy that the pro-immigration lobby promised us would arrive? Well, needless to say, that was always a lie. Mass immigration doesn't enhance the economic productivity of Western countries at all, especially not when it's mass migration from poor countries with different cultures that invites foreign hostile cultures and ethnicities that don't simply fail to assimilate, but become a burden on the society, and then eventually that sparks the racial clash that we saw back in August of last year. Nothing has improved since. If anything, the situation has gotten completely worse. However, the British elites have come up with a solution to this problem. Listen to this article, which came out in the Financial Times recently, called "Europe Must Trim Its Welfare State to Build a Warfare State." So obviously, as things precipitously decline inside the United Kingdom, France, Germany, etc., across the European continent, the Euro elites, in all of their wisdom, have decided to double down on external war, of course. So listen to what this author in the Financial Times argues that Great Britain should be doing. The welfare state, as we have known it, must retreat somewhat, not enough that we will no longer call it by that name, but enough to hurt. It was never designed for a world in which living to 100 is banal. It was never meant to enable such things as Britain's current out-of-work benefits bill. The rise in social spending over the past century has been uncannily global, encompassing Japan, the US, Australia, Canada, but the absolute levels are highest in Europe. As the most militarily exposed of those places, this isn't tenable. The question is whether the public agrees. I have come to doubt whether rich democratic societies can make difficult reforms, except in a crisis. Chronic discomfort isn't enough. An element of real fear has to come in, as perhaps it has now. There's another reason to believe that spending cuts are easier to sell on behalf of defense than on behalf of a generalized notion of efficiency. Defense itself has welfarist properties. The U.S. military doubles up as a vocational trainer, college degree sponsor, and above all, employer, quite often in less gilded states such as Kansas and Kentucky, which host army bases. If European defense budgets edge towards 4% of GDP, the potential for their social function to grow with it isn't trifling. Still, that isn't the purpose of defense, and politicians must insist on this point. The purpose is survival. Europe must never again find itself in a position where the likes of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance have life and death power over it. All other priorities are secondary. By now, quick-minded readers will have registered what a more militarized, less welfarist continent would evoke, the superpower that is turning from it, us. As a result of their geopolitical estrangement, Europe and America could end up looking much more like each other than they did before, as two blocks of a cohesive West. Whether this is an irony or a paradox or something else, it would be enough to raise half a smile were the circumstances less desperate. In other words, Europe's welfare state is at capacity. It's been completely mismanaged, and it's been overwhelmed by foreigners that aren't even subjects of Great Britain. And if they are, they have not assimilated into the UK, nor can they. That administration, that welfare state itself is already at capacity. It's collapsing. So the proposal in the Financial Times, and my guess is that Keir Starmer and the elites in Great Britain would agree with this, is that we need to repurpose what's left of a bastardized and diluted welfare state to fighting a war with Russia. And this somehow may redirect the population's focus elsewhere and salvage what's left of a country that's on the verge of collapse. Ladies and gentlemen, these three stories, debt, nukes, and civil war, this is a characterization of exactly the madness of the elites that are running the Western world into the ground. Just bear in mind that this is not part of some overarching plan. This is the complete lobotomy of an elite that have no idea what to do. They have lost all manner of control. They don't understand how fragile the societies are that they preside over.
What those machinations on the part of the British elite at that time represented was effectively elite overreach, which is a term often used in discussion of domestic turmoil in foreign societies, a situation in which elites essentially have exceeded the boundaries of their own legitimate capability.
Yes.
in ways that had the tendency to undermine broader faith in the coherence and the validity of the status quo.
And as a result, on all three of these fronts, economic implosion, civil war domestically, and external war, are increasingly likely in the weeks and months ahead. Where are we headed exactly? Well, I don't think this means the collapse of the West. I really don't. I think this means that the European Union, that NATO, that the IMF, the World Bank, the supranational order in Europe is definitely headed for a collapse. And I think the two-party system in the United States and the Fed and the banking system and so forth is headed for a collapse. They are bringing it about themselves. That's not to say that liberation is ahead in the very near future. It is to say that a kind of political transformation in the midst of this collapse is imminent. It's going to happen. And some major form of domestic disturbance is in our midst. I think most of you know that. These are the areas in which that demolition is going to happen.
The emerging anti-status quo ideas, identity movements within the white community have the potential for mass mobilization on account of the fact that the white population is still the majority population of the country. You need a mass population to support a mass movement.
I want to finish by just mentioning briefly what is happening in France. It was released this week that Marine Le Pen, who is running for president and leads the national rally in France, has basically been banned from politics and put under house arrest. Now the charges and the details of that really don't matter. The bottom line is that elites across the Western world have basically guaranteed that the legacy order, the legacy structure will not be reformed at all. That means it's going to collapse. How long, how much further are we on this runway of revolution? I don't think we're that much farther. So something sudden, some major event is imminent, and it could happen on any of these fronts. It could happen domestically in the banking system, could happen overseas with this escalation against Iran, maybe in Eastern Europe, and of course it could happen in terms of some kind of flashpoint domestically. Either way, the end of cycle event is nearly here. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.